I'm very happy to welcome all of you here today to our first session of this new series, which we are launching as of today, the World HandCOV'd. In the crisis, people have to become creative. All of us working from home, or most of us working from home, and trying to find ways to make our life comfortable in these circumstances that we have. Yesterday, my wife and I, who usually enjoy going to the cinema, came up with the idea of creating our own little open air cinema. We have a small patch, which I refer to as garden. My wife, who is from the countryside, says this is not a garden, this is only a cage without a roof. But I had an old projector standing somewhere, so we created our own little open air cinema, so we can go now to the movies without being in danger and endangering other people. The movie we watched yesterday was just a short documentary, about 20 minutes, about the region where General Hodges is joining us from today, from Hessen, which is my home country, and is the home region in my home country of Germany, which is always called the fairy tale country. So there's a lot of castles and mountains. And there was a documentary made from a helicopter. So the helicopter was flying around Hessen and filming the countryside. And there was a lot of these perspectives when the camera was physically moving towards one of the motives. So the helicopter was flying in there, but it was zooming out. So you have this effect that the castle or whatever was focusing stays the same size, or even comes closer to you, while everything else is going away. So the point I made was camera moving into an object while zooming out. So things in the middle remain the same and everything else is going crazy. And this was supposed to be a metaphor for the situation that we see at the moment. So at the same time, developments come to a halt while everything else around them has been speeding up very much. So people were caught by surprise, startled by the pandemic. There were panic reactions in many places. Governments had to react, and societies were reacting, and people were trying to understand what is actually happening here. We have seen dystopian scenarios come up. We have seen utopian scenarios. I read an article 2 months ago where the author said everything is going to be so perfect after this pandemic. People are going to be really nice. We have an eco-future starting now. People understand the meaning of life. And of course, you have people that say that the pandemic is made up in order to and the civic freedom, so dictatorships are taking over the world. I think both perspectives are wrong for obvious reasons, but still people are struggling, analysts are struggling, and politicians to understand what is really happening and how the world will be different. So to a certain extent, the world has been taken hostage by the virus. This is what the reason why we've chosen this title, the World HandCOV'd. So COVID taking the world hostage at the moment because things are changing, but nobody really seems to know why. We do want to know what is going to happen and how things are going to change, and especially with the partner Minsk Dialogue, what all of this, what we see happening at the moment, will mean for security in Central and Eastern Europe. So this event, on the one hand, continues a tradition that we have been talking about, the repercussions of world affairs on Central and Eastern Europe. On the other hand, it establishes a new format. We are talking to each other here in this online format with all the interesting peculiarities that this brings, what we've seen and witnessed today. So we don't have a crystal ball either to really predict the future, but what we do have is expertise and networks of partners and even more experts. We want to understand what happens, explain what is happening to broader audiences and policymakers, and connect people that talk about this. So what trends will change, speed up, alter direction, hold still? Looking at the global trends, this is what we've discussed with Eugenii in the beginning, what also was laid out in the concept, would be difficult. So we want to take a closer look at the pillars that make up international affairs and security, and we want to assess the longer-term implications of the pandemic disruption for international security. So in this online series, we want to look at countries, the first of them being the US today, but also at China, Russia, Germany, the UK, France, but also at international institutions such as NATO, the OCE, Shanghai Cooperation, or the Eurasian Economic Union, to understand how they will change behavior or be unaltered by the virus, and to put this together at the end to see what this will mean for Eastern Europe. Belarus is not on this list of a country as a pillar of transatlantic and Eurasian security, but it's in the middle of all of these processes. We want to take conclusions from the discussions for Belarus and the region. So thanks a lot for all of those who made this possible today, to all the experts that have already agreed to join us, many of them from my own institution, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, from the international offices, as well as the headquarters in Berlin, but especially also to our partner Minsk Dialogue, represented today by Johanny Breyermann, who is co-hosting and will be moderating most of this discussion today, and for your expert networks who are going to make this possible over the course of the next 3 months. So we have publications that will be published in the future, always before the event, and then high-ranking events to discuss what was laid down in the publications and what we think the trends will be with experts online. Thanks to the co-partner, thanks to all supporters, thanks to the interpreter that will be joining us in the future. Not today, today is only English, we're still working on this, but there will be interpreters in the future. And today we start the discussion with the two authors who have laid out their papers. Dr. Andrzej Kazakiewicz, the director of the Institute of Political Studies, Political Sphere from Belarus, and my colleague, Mr. Paul Linartz, who is the country director of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's office in Washington. We start with you because it's America's first today, and our two high-ranking experts, General Ben Hodges, who is the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies and the Center for European Policy Analysis, and the former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, and Dr. Michal Troitsky, the Dean of the MGIMO School of Government and International Affairs from Russia. Welcome to all of you. I wish us a wonderful and fruitful discussion without further disturbances.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And of course, on behalf of the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations, I want to thank all our speakers, all the contributors to the project. It's a great pleasure to be working with all you. And Jakob, thanks a lot for many creative ideas that are helping to make this project so exciting. And as you can see, we are officially launching the project with this all-star webinar. Jakob has already said that we decided to follow Donald Trump's advice and to stick to America First principles. So out of the 13 pillars of international security that we'll be exploring throughout this project with debates, but also with research pieces, America will come first. And Jakob, thanks a lot. You've already introduced our all-star panel. So in order to save time, I'm not going to do that again. Just one sort of housekeeping thing I wanted to emphasize. We'll begin with two brief presentations by the authors of the two papers. One of them, Paul Linartz, joining us from DC, and the paper is already online, so everyone is very welcome to read it. And the other paper, which has been written by Dr. Kazakiewicz, will be posted during the day today, and you'll also have a chance to read it in further detail. But now, please, Paul, the floor, or the virtual floor, is all yours, and let's kick off the discussion.
On my mic. Okay, now you can hear me. Okay, again, thank you so much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon to each and everyone. I've been asked to kind of summarize the key takeaways of my brief report. I put 4 key takeaways at the beginning of my paper, and I would try within the next 5 minutes to elaborate on these 4 key takeaways and keep it as brief as possible. The first one was COVID-19 will not fundamentally change the focus of US security policy, in my opinion. However, the crisis has increased the pressure for accelerated reforms in some areas. Keyword for these reforms is, in my opinion, enhanced resilience. What do I mean? From an international perspective, a lot of, let's say, tweets and announcements from Washington, D.C. Might come as a surprise, at least for the public debate. They are considered often disruptive, counterproductive, and unilateral. Even within the US, of course, among media outlets, relevant ministries and authorities, also among members of Congress, the timing and wording of these government messages and announcements is sometimes considered uncoordinated or excessive. And it is, of course, absolutely right to discuss this in detail and critically After all, reliability, credibility, and trust are, as say, the most important currency of international diplomacy. However, it is often, let's say, overlooked that many of the US security policy priorities and strategies are fixed or laid down, sometimes since years, in various resolutions and papers. And if you at least look at the topics of, let's say, the messages from Washington, D.C., the announcement, the tweets, many things become less surprising against the backdrop of these strategies. In my report, I briefly referred to the national security strategy, the summary of the national defense strategy, and, for example, the national cyber strategy. COVID-19, from my point of view, will not change these strategies. Nevertheless, COVID-19 has, of course, an influence on US security policy. For example, the pandemic will play a role in the congressional deliberations on the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, for the next fiscal year, and I'm sure also beyond. So in the defense budget, money will be set aside for research on the virus, the impact of pandemics on military operations, and so on. COVID-19 will also influence the issue of national resilience against cyber attacks. This is not new. We all know about disinformation campaigns, especially in election years. But I believe that COVID-19 has now re-emphasized the, how can I say, digital, perhaps, vulnerabilities of the US, but also, of course, of many other countries. So in this area, the pressure for additional protection has, in my opinion, increased. The second key takeaway of my report was, regardless who will reside in the White House for the next term starting in 2021, US security policy will continue to be linked, closely linked to the country's economic, trade, and energy policy interests. In recent years, we have all followed closely the developments of the trade conflict, trade dispute between the US and China, possible changes for global supply chains, etc. This too has now been influenced by COVID-19 when it comes to personal protection equipment, PPE, and the dependency on vaccines and pharmaceutical products, of course. But COVID-19 is also about energy security and the dependence of the US on energy imports from abroad. Oil prices have plummeted, demand has fallen sharply, and the US energy industry is under considerable financial pressure. This is also a key security policy issue for the United States of America. My last two takeaways in my brief paper have been, although the broad lines of US security policy, from my point of view, will not be changed by COVID-19, specific steps and political initiatives of the upcoming years will, of course, depend on the outcome of the presidential election in November and future majorities in Congress. And the last one was the future multilateral security engagement of the US will depend even more than before, from my point of view, on whether existing agreements and alliances serve the national interests. What do I mean? The 2 points are, in my opinion, kind of linked together. What I mean is, in the coming years, we may see a different approach by the US in dealing with international agreements and multilateral organizations. This does not necessarily mean, however, that everything will remain as it is if Donald Trump is going to be re-elected, or that everything will change if there is a change of government. I personally believe that the US will perhaps in the future cooperate more closely again with multilateral organizations, but that the pressure, and this is the key point, the pressure to reform these organizations will not diminish, even for international agreements. For the US, it will always be a question of how quickly and effectively these organizations can adapt to new challenges and whether the rules of these agreements and organizations can be effectively enforced. The immense economic consequences of COVID-19 have, in my point of view, significantly increased these requirements. So far for the beginning.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I think we'll go directly to Andrei. Please, Andrei, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Evgeny and Jakob, for possibility to participate in this debate. Speaking about American current strategy, I think it's important to take into consideration some general trends concerning political and economic development of the world. As known, the US contribution to the world's GDP is constantly decreasing due to the growth of other countries. If in the beginning of the 90s, the US share was about 30%, now it's about 20%, depending on the methodology which we use to estimate. So some changes in the relations of the United States with partners and enemies are inevitable. And I think the crisis can only slow down, or of course it's not the first crisis for America, but it has a number of differences. For the first time since the decline of the Soviet Union, there is another economically comparable and friendly to United States country, which is active at the international stage. That's why political outcomes of this crisis, of the current crisis, could be very different from the crisis of 2008. At the same time, the United States is experiencing a period of deep political divide, internal divide, possibly the deepest since 70s. And this makes the United States position even more difficult. And finally, I'd like, unlike during many other similar crises, now United States can't be perceived as a good example of crisis management. In general, the United States faces a crisis in rather difficult moment. What the answers would be? I think that three main scenarios are possible. There is much discussions now around the possibility of a new Cold War, some fierce confrontation between United States and China. Personally, I don't think that such scenario is possible because it's very difficult to wage war, even Cold War, during economic crisis, and it will be very difficult to mobilize partners and allies for such actions now. But of course, such scenario is possible. The next is some kind of great deal. A deal between United States and China, probably unstable, short term. And I understand that now such a deal seems practically incredible and impossible, but in crisis conditions, such things sometimes happen. So it's the other option, or the second scenario. And to my mind, such scenario will stimulate isolationist trends in US foreign policy, and actually weakening of US partnership with other countries like European countries, Japan, Australia, and so on. And the third option, which is probably the most likely, and I agree with Paul according to this point, it's a called soft containment and at the same institution building, as this is some kind of a return to what might be called traditional US policy after the Cold War, strengthening ties, strengthening institutions, creating coalitions, but at the same time, without a sharp confrontation at international stage. And probably it will be the best option for the world. At the same time, it doesn't matter which of the scenarios will come true. In the nearest future, the United States, like other countries, will be weakened by the crisis, and its presence and its capacities will decrease. We will feel it in a year or two, and I think it's inevitable. The only question is whether transatlantic relations with other partners like Japan, Australia, will be weakened, or whether they will receive a new development, some kind of reorganization according to the crisis outcomes, according to current changes in the world politics and economy. And probably the last point is that strengthening of Euro-Atlantic institutions can now take place not due to strengthening of American presence or American assistance, but the strengthening of the partners and strengthening their responsibilities and resilience and their readiness to resolve security issues themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei, and thank you, Paul, once again for these presentations and for the papers. Before we dive deeper into some of the things that you covered, may I ask Ben to share some immediate thoughts about what we've just heard?
If I didn't know better, I think we were looking at the end of the United States. I mean, this was a pretty depressing presentation or description by Andrei and even Paul, who was there in the U.S. That has a good view. I mean, and certainly if all you know is what you see on TV or read about, there's a lot to be concerned. I would agree that the domestic political division inside the United States is hard to watch, frankly. It's hard to watch, and it can be discouraging. But I would also say that about the vast majority of Americans don't wake up in the morning thinking about what's going on in Washington or New York. They're focused on what they do, their family, their job, that sort of thing. I think that we stumbled on our initial response to the pandemic, and the White House, the administration, has not done a good job of uniting people. So this is not helped, and it's exacerbated by the fact that this is an election year, and as the last 3 or 4 elections have been, this one is going to be extremely close, and so a lot of things are magnified. A lot of the friction, I think, is magnified because people are looking at it through an electoral lens. And I would never make a prediction about what's going to happen. I would say that people should not assume or expect that the president will not be reelected, but certainly partly because he's got a core that is very strong, and it's like no matter what, it's very strong. Just like there is a core that's against him, no matter what. So it's that, as usual, that 10 to 15% that are in the middle, and it'll come down to turnout. And to be blunt, the presumed Democratic challenger is not, he's disadvantaged right now because they're having to do everything virtually. And so his strength is not being deployed. Which is why there's so much attention on who will be his vice presidential candidate. So all of these things will have an effect. So that's why it's impossible to make a prediction. And after the last election, nobody should dare make a prediction about an election outcome anyway. Having said all that, I think there are probably three things that will be constant no matter who the president is. And in this case, I certainly agree with Paul that the pandemic doesn't change the strategic security concerns. And the same threats that were there before the pandemic are there now, and they'll be there 6 months after the pandemic is declared over. Number one, and this is where I disagree with Andre, if I understood you correctly, I believe that we're going to be in a kinetic conflict with China in less than 10 years, maybe even within 5 years. Obviously, I hope I'm wrong, but when you look at the language coming out of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party leadership, what they're doing in Hong Kong now, and the language they've used about Taiwan, and they're watching how the West, frankly, including the United States, is distracted. I see an increasing belligerence. They're smashing up Vietnamese fishing boats in the South China Sea. All of these things are coming together. And I think the hardliners in Beijing are telling President Xi that now is the time, certainly within the next couple of years. So I think this is a problem. And so the United States recognizes this. That's why the National Defense Strategy talks about great power competition and why it emphasizes the importance of having allies. And the United States does not have enough capacity to deter Russia, contain Iran, and be in a conflict with China, and do all the other things that are going on to keep open the Persian Gulf, for example, and the global commons that everybody depends on. The U.S. does not have the capacity to do all of that. So that's why there's a sense of urgency in the administration to get a stronger European pillar, to strengthen the alliance, and make sure that that the European pillar can continue to deter the Kremlin if the United States is in a conflict with China. Obviously, I hope I am completely wrong, but this is what it feels like. Second, this great power competition is not just military, it's about economic competition. And in the Chinese effort with the Belt Road Initiative, the 17+1, all of these things are designed to split up the EU, to peel off countries, to exploit the cracks in the cohesion of these two institutions, NATO and the European Union, and create dependencies. And instead of the U.S. Threatening allies that if you buy Huawei 5G, for example, we're going to crush you, or we're going to cut you off, we should be competing and coming up with a better solution, because we need allies. And I think that the constant threats and the negative pressure doesn't help with cohesion. Instead, we should be competing in the economic space as even more than we are in the military space. And then my last sort of point on all of this, this is where the relationship between the United States and Germany is so important. Germany is our most important ally. I know it doesn't feel like it right now. It doesn't look like it all the time. But Germany is probably the only country that can influence Kremlin behavior and perhaps influence Chinese behavior. Nobody else can do that. And so the United States should be working hard to make sure that we are locked arms with the Federal Republic of Germany. Even yesterday, Chancellor Merkel talked about the relationship between the United States and the European Union is the most important relationship for Europe as well, even if it's troubled at this time.
Thank you, Ben. And before I pass it over to Mikhail, I just want to tell you that we are now live on Facebook, so our technical magicians have made it possible. Thanks so much. Mikhail, so how does it all look from Moscow and all those points made by Andre and Paul? Any comments on that?
Sure. Thank you, Evgeny, for having me. And let me just stress from the outset that in no way do I represent anyone other than myself. And I'm not sure whether my views are representative of what Russia or Moscow or or the Kremlin behind me may think. But let me just offer, in my personal capacity, in a few reactions to what the three distinguished speakers have said right now. I'll just address a couple of specific issues, and then I think I'm going to make a more general comment. And kind of my overarching idea is that the expectations or fears, whatever you have, about an imminent decline of the United States as a global power are at best premature. And my point is that the COVID crisis, if we are just talking about the COVID crisis, is rather strengthening the U.S. hand than weakening it. But before I just talk a little bit about that general observation, I wanted to mention to respond a little bit to this information war and cybersecurity thing that Mr. Linnertz raised. I guess that the COVID pandemic just showed that the cost of a freewheeling post-truth society is going to increase, and it might not be sustainable because people's lives actually depend on discrimination between different points of view, right? So every point of view has the right to exist, but except that people's lives may depend on whether people start drinking bleach, as a countermeasure against COVID. So at least the Western society will have to look into some kind of vetting of information that has the potential of spreading on the web and in the media and affecting human lives. And I think Twitter has just started doing that by taking issue with, not really taking issue, but just saying, this particular tweet by the US president needs a little bit of, vetting, and you might want to look here for some more information on what he's just said. So I guess it kind of crystallizes the problem of the need to actually fight for the truth, as opposed to just maintain the nominal equality of all sort of points of view and of all narratives, right? So that is going to strengthen, that kind of struggle is going to be pushed forward. Then whether alliances serve US interests, I think the discussion will be continued after Trump and certainly under Trump. But my point is that even under President Biden, alliances, U.S. alliances, will never be again be taken for granted, and I guess President Biden would like to vet some of those alliances and would not sign off on the deals that President Trump kind of ruined or put in jeopardy. He'll look to also benefit from the current situation of suspense in those alliances, and he will not waste the chance to get concessions from the allies, however disgruntled they may be about this current posture of the Trump administration, right? And my point is that everyone will have little choice but to align with the United States. So this choice, are you with the United States or are you against it? That President Trump kind of dramatized in a few cases, not like President George W. Bush. In a different manner, he's looking to make deals, but in order to make deals, he feels that he has to dramatize those choices. And I don't think there's a viable counter strategy among allies, U.S. allies, and I'm going to say also among U.S. adversaries against this strategy. So this choice will become more stark, and the freedom of maneuver for everyone will be limited. and I guess most of European allies will have to align with the United States, because they had a run with economic nationalism and with hectic multipolar politics in Europe, and they had enough of it, and they understand that at the end of the day, their security depends on them being able to kind of come together and figure out their contradictions, especially in this hamstrung or HandCOV'd world, as you just put it. So I think the United States alliances are going to benefit from it. But I think the general was correct when he said that the United States may find it useful to adopt some of the practices, some of the best practices from its European allies, including the German experience of successfully combating the pandemic, and I believe at least some of President Trump's advisors have learned some lessons from Germany. And then and apparently my other point is that in response to, I think, what Andrei mentioned, is that and also in support of Paul's general point about continuity in US policy beyond the pandemic, I guess that COVID is unlikely to make a direct political impact on US international posture and foreign policy. So if there's an impact, and there will be no posture adjustment on any of the major issues by the Trump administration, and also by a prospective Biden administration, who will try to bank or to benefit from the position that Trump has taken quite successfully, I believe, in relations both with European allies and China and even Russia, and I'll be happy to elaborate on that later. But the point is that the causal chain of the impact on the US posture is going to be economic, if at all, right? And here, I guess the calculus maybe of the Trump administration may be that even though the pandemic hit the US badly in terms of human toll, and clearly, the administration mismanaged or has been mismanaging the response to the pandemic so far, I think that the structural fallout, meaning the negative consequences of the pandemic, are going to be much harsher for the rest of the world than for the United States. And it has been proved, and that's going to be my last sentence, it has been proved that that pandemics and other similar crises hit poorer segments of the global population, of the international community, much more badly than the rich segments. So much of the rest of the world will admittedly be reeling from the pandemic for much longer than the United States. So their ability to thwart US policies is likely to become weaker, not stronger. And the US pharma, by the way, I believe stands to benefit from its advances on the way towards producing some anti-COVID vaccine. So I believe if there's an impact, it's going to be economic, and it's actually going to undermine the foundations of power among those who are currently kind of balking at the United States, obstructing US policies around the world. And I guess that even the Trump administration, that many here may be skeptical of, kind of is in a good position to benefit from that trend. That would be my take. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Since we're now both on Facebook and here in Zoom, and we have quite some people watching, I just want to encourage everyone to post questions. We already have a question, which I'll get back to in a couple of minutes. But as I said, everyone is welcome, and those on Facebook, please leave your questions or comments in the Minsk Dialogue group, and then we'll be able to read it. So before we go for those questions, let me ask sort of a silly question myself. So most of you have now stressed that this strategic competition and fight between the US and China is going to grow in size and intensity, and in this or that way, it will be forcing pretty much everyone else in the world to make choices, so it will be more difficult to somehow stay away or try to clinch to a neutral position. But what is it that the U.S. is going to fight for? Again, I'm just emphasizing this is probably a silly question, but when we watch some of the U.S. international moves right now, I think a lot of people are quite sort of lost in those interpretations, because the way the DC and the White House in particular are treating allies, and we've already discussed a little bit of that. Some of the other impulses which have been sent to, let's say, the multilateral system and all those things happening to the U.S. at the UN or other multilateral organizations. So it looks like we cannot simply presume that the U.S. is going to fight for this sort of unipolar moment to continue. So what is it in essence and in reality that the Washington is going to fight for in this big strategic competition with China? And what should it mean ultimately for the rest of the world, both U.S. allies, but also countries like Belarus, which seem to be lost somewhere in between, as we sometimes put it? And that's a question to everyone, whoever wants to start. Please, Ben, go on.
Well, first of all, Belarus is not lost in the middle. Your great country is a sovereign country, and the United States, I'm very pleased here in the last 2 years, has begun to take steps to once again normalize relationship between the United States and Belarus, not cause Belarus to have to make a choice, but to provide some alternatives for energy, for investment, so that Belarus can continue to act and be a sovereign, independent country. So I'm disagreeing with a minor point that you made about somehow Belarus is lost in the middle. I'm looking forward very much to when we have normal ambassadors back in place and all of that. That's will be good for everybody. For the United States, the reason that President Trump was elected, because he tapped into a growing frustration by a lot of people that globalization had led to offshoring factories, jobs, that capitalism had a dark side, if you will, or had a downside. That's a better way to say it. That in a digital world cost jobs, and so big parts of the society felt like they were being left behind, and he was able to tap into that. And there was a sense that some of the international agreements. And by the way, I'm not defending the Trump administration. I'm trying to describe a couple of aspects of it. The international agreements and institutions, also, that the United States was carrying a load, but not, but the institutions were not fulfilling their obligation, their reason for existence. The most recent thing, of course, the Open Skies Treaty. The United States is highlighted for years, and the Secretary General of NATO confirmed it, that Russia has not lived up to its obligations within the Open Skies Treaty. Same thing with the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Russia had been in violation for years. Now, I personally would much rather see the United States stay inside these international institutions. I would rather see the United States lead, not leave, because I think we're better off working with allies and partners through these institutions. And I know that most European countries, particularly Germany, values these institutions because they see them as a brake, if you will, a B-R-A-K-E, brake on bad actors, on bad decisions. If everybody is kind of enmeshed in international organizations. And I don't disagree with that. The problem is just by being a member of these treaties or agreements or institutions does not automatically, therefore, produce the outcome that we hope for, whether it's the United Nations, NATO, or something at a lower end. And I think I wish that the criticisms of the United States for withdrawing from this and from WHO and from Open Skies and INF, I wish the criticisms that have been so loud, I wish those same voices in countries like Germany had been real loud about Russian violations that got us to where we are. That now all of a sudden everybody's very interested. And I think this is where the United States should be working closely with our oldest, most reliable allies, the members of NATO, as well as Australia and a couple of others, as well as some partners, to put pressure on the Kremlin to live up to what it said it will do, whether we're talking about the Minsk process for Ukraine, or Open Skies Treaty, or INF. I think we're better if we stay inside of them. But you can see that there's a lot of the country, to include in the Congress, that sees that the United States we're paying for it, but we're not getting the effect that we expected to get. And the same thing is true with China. Hold China accountable. And this is why I'll close. I think our relationship with Germany is so important, and that we should be working much more closely together.
Thank you. And any more thoughts on this? Like, sort of where the U.S. wants to find itself in this strategic fight against China? Is it still trying to preserve the unipolar moment, or is it even possible? If not, is it kind of adaptation to make sure that the spheres of influence do not grow, or is it anything else? Paul, please.
Can I?
I can do that. Okay, I can see. I can switch on my mic. I thought it's the host who could only do that. Ben, it's the same with me. I do not take any sides. I just try to describe a little bit about the key components, key aspects of the discussion here in Washington, D.C. when it comes to the U.S. and China. And Ben already mentioned the key word, and that's accountability. One of the aspects, the first issue I'd like to raise, or the first point I'd like to raise, is the basic challenges, or the way the US is understanding right now competition with China, challenges with China, and so on, is not new. Is nothing the Trump administration first paid attention to. It's this basically, let's say, the first discussions started already in 2001 or after 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, and then it went on and on and on, and the pivot to Asia during the Obama administration, or even to a certain extent TPP. There was kind of a way to deal with this kind of increasing competition with China. And yes, it's a lot about trade, it's a lot about intellectual property, but as I said before, it's, from the US point of view, predominantly about accountability and let's say level playing fields. A few major problems the US have when it comes to China is, for example, intellectual property. The other issue is definitely subsidies to state-owned companies, or companies which at least have some state component. That's the two issue. I think on the long term, what is even more important from the US perspective is issues related to new technologies and artificial intelligence, and accountability and rules and regulations everybody has to comply with, especially in this area, because artificial intelligence, the whole development of artificial intelligence is profoundly changing economies. It's profoundly changing our way of life. It's profoundly changing communication, and so on and so on. And this is definitely, in my opinion, from my point of view, one of the core aspects of that increased competition with China.
Evgeny, can I just chime in briefly?
Sure.
My take on it is that I guess if one consequence of the COVID crisis that we are kind of looking at as the anchor for today's meeting is this new era of what I'd call new mass politics. And I think that the social costs and the social implications, socioeconomic implications of the pandemic is going to cause more kind of civil activism and it's going to result in more influence and a stronger influence exerted by the public opinion on the foreign policies of the stakeholders, so to say. And that is going to be almost universal, and it's certainly going to affect the United States and its European, some of the Asian allies. And especially in the United States, so far, Donald Trump has just been sort of catering to the tastes of his electorate. And that was, if you ask me, about one force that I think has been driving Donald Trump in his foreign policy, that would be his re-election bid. And it is very natural, and it's neither good nor bad. So I guess he will have to act on the whims or on the preferences of the U.S. Electorate, and so will President Biden. And in that regard, I think although there are difficulties and that is going to drive the United States posture vis-a-vis China, and all those issues like intellectual property and trade and even human rights, given in places like Hong Kong, given the activism by some of the non-governmental organizations that he has to reckon with, Donald Trump has to reckon with as well. All those pressures will come to shape the U.S. posture, which is, I think, is going into a very clear direction of a stronger pressure being applied to China by Washington. And the same, I think, will be happening in Europe. And here I kind of react to the comment that was sent to me by Ian Anthony. I guess the European governments may play for a while with this liberty of choice in foreign policy and or just maybe getting into a free drift in world politics, but very soon they'll realize that the opinion of the electorate as to how they are coping with the economic challenges is going to depend on their ability to maintain the liberal sort of trade system and the transnational interactions that unite the transatlantic community and all this, hub and spokes network in Asia. So I think that there are limits as to how far they can go before they just get kicked out. And they will have to reckon with it. So I'm pretty optimistic, and I don't quite share some of the criticisms with regard to the Russian posture on arms control, but you can easily see how popular pressures on Donald Trump or pressures from his constituencies on Donald Trump kind of result on him pulling out of all those treaties. Aside from those alleged violations by Russia, I mean it's very cheap, and it's kind of catering to the tastes of conservative Republicans that he kind of depends upon and that he wants to court in the US. So it's very easy and cheap to just walk out of those agreements. But even the President Biden is going to capitalize on that situation, with others wanting to make deals with the United States, wanting to maintain those agreements. So that's my take at this moment.
Can we dive a little bit deeper on this latest point? Sorry, Andrei?
Yeah.
Okay, please go on, then we'll return to this, yes.
our positions, I mean, within this discussion are rather conservative. I mean that Euro-Atlantic relations will develop and there is no real threat for them. But and I think it's reasonable. But to maybe make this discussion more complex, I would like to draw some attention to the fact that now we are at the beginning of the crisis, and I mean economic crisis mainly, not coronavirus crisis per se. And it's very difficult to predict how long this crisis will be. And in this context, it's, I think, useful to compare this crisis with some other common periods of history. For instance, the events that happened after 2008 and how transatlantic relations were changed. And I think that case of Turkey is very important in this context because these relations were practically revised, and this now the problem for cooperation within NATO and cooperation of UNES and Turkey and so on and so forth. And of course, it was very difficult to predict at the beginning of the crisis. And to my mind, it's the outcome of this economic crisis that began in 2008. Probably some unpredictable events like this Turkey case could happen after in 2, 3, or 4 years, because we just don't know how long the situation, economic situation, will be declining. And the second point is also historical comparison. Probably this crisis and crisis of 70s. And it's well known that this decade was the decade of detente and relationships with Soviet Union and the United States were revised because mainly of economic reasons. So probably long economic crisis will be some kind of reason to avoid confrontation between the United States and China, because to my mind, this confrontation it's very encouraging thing if you have stable economic growth, as it was during Donald Trump presidential term. But if you have a steady decline, it's not so interesting, because it's very it could become very unpopular, actually. Thank you.
Okay, that's quite a different take, and I guess we're not voting on it, but Andre or anyone else. So if we have these two opposite possibilities, so COVID-19 and what we observed today leading to an accelerated confrontation between US and China, or the other one, as you, Andre, said, it's sort of pushing the two towards some compromises to make sure that red lines are not crossed, and at least a relative degree of peace can be sustained. When can we understand that for sure? What indications can be found out there, and how quickly? Andre, do you yourself have an answer?
I think it's impossible to predict now, because we're now at the starting point of the crisis. So it's impossible. That's my opinion. But we should think about all possible scenarios. And for me, for instance, it's not so incredible. Of course, if we speak about a contemporary understanding of American foreign policy, contemporary views and so on and so forth, it looks like impossible. But in historic perspective, we have many examples when such things just happened because of some unpredictable events, and because of some long crisis. Because if the crisis is short, okay, nothing will change. But if this crisis will last, 4 years, for instance, and 5 years, I think it's more and more possible.
Ben, you argued quite emphatically about a different kind of scenario, and actually predicting that within quite a few years we might say, well, something really serious happening. Why do you think we don't really have much hope about what Andrei was saying, and why don't you think that this sort of scenario of more cooperation rather than confrontation is possible?
Well, obviously, I prefer cooperation. I prefer the alliance sticking together. I prefer the United States working, leading with international organizations and other countries. The last thing in the world I would want to see that anybody that's ever served in the military would ever want to see is a conflict. But we know from history that when there is a miscalculation about willpower and about capabilities, people will make bad judgments. The best way to make sure that we don't have a conflict between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia is through strong alliances and clear, very clear, strong language about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think that the U.S. can be most effective and have a sort of a cooperative spirit when there's transparency. And we have nations like Germany, France, UK, other Western European countries where we are arm in arm and holding China accountable, requiring it to live up to what it said it would do when it was accepted into the World Trade Organization. Transparency, all the things that are necessary, which China refuses to do so far. So in order to prevent the conflict, we're going to have to compete in the information space as well as in the economic space, and of course, in diplomatic and the military space. I do believe that great power competition prevents great power conflict. So I mean, we have to compete in the diplomatic space. We have to compete in the information space. Not one single person breathing today should believe any of the nonsense that comes out of the CCP about numbers that they report, about the causes, or pretty much about anything. I mean, they don't deserve the trust of the rest of the world on the things that they say. So we have to hold them accountable for truthful reporting. And then that's the foundation that you can start moving towards. China has expressed zero interest. In fact, they flat out refused to take part in any kind of arms control agreements. The United States, obviously, and I believe Russia also, in their heart of hearts, prefers that New START would include China as well. Why in the world would we limit ourselves and weaken ourselves while the adversary, the potential adversary with which we are most likely to have a conflict, continues unabated to arm and modernize themselves? That no government should do that and allow such risk for their populations and for their allies. I think that Russia, even though the language that comes out of the Kremlin accuses the West, NATO lied, NATO is encroaching. In their heart of hearts, they know in the Kremlin that the safest part of their border is the part that touches NATO. That there is no attack coming from Estonia or Lithuania or Poland or Romania into Russia. They know that, but yet the hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of border that they have with China is wide open. This is where their biggest threat is, and hopefully on 24 June, when President Putin, who stands out there on Red Square to commemorate Victory Day on the rescheduled day, which I still can't believe that they're actually going to do this. There's no way. I mean, even Germany has not opened up all of its borders by then, but yet Russia is going to have their big Victory Day celebration. I hope he stands up there and says, I was wrong. NATO is not a threat. Our biggest threat is China, and we need to figure out how do we reduce the chance of a conflict with any of our neighbors?
We don't have much time left, but actually we have at least two questions which we need to address. So let me proceed with those. The first one we got from Professor Rosa Torobekova, and she's asking about the possible effects of COVID-19 on U.S. involvement in Central Asia. And of course, we all remember about the agreement that the U.S. negotiated with the Taliban, and also how does it all look against the background of the growing tension with China and the priorities which are there in the U.S. strategy for Central Asia. I guess, Ben, we can again begin with you, and then the others, if they have something to add.
I think, first of all, we've been trying to get out of Afghanistan for years. You know, President Obama tried it. This was always going to have to be a negotiated settlement. We didn't leave when we should have, which was the first year. After the Taliban were kicked out, that was, we should have bitten the bullet and left way back then, 17 years ago. Instead, here we are, unbelievably, in 2020, still there with thousands of troops from multiple countries. Of course, it's discouraging or disappointing. I was there for 15 months, 2009 to 2010 in Kandahar. That we had the most troops we had ever had. We had the most stuff. But because we were not willing, we, the West, were not willing to do what it took with regards to Pakistan, that meant the Taliban were forever going to have endless safe haven. And I don't think there's an example in the world of when an insurgency, where the insurgent had adjacent safe haven, that they were defeated. And we were not willing to do what it took, which would have involved some painful diplomatic and economic decisions with regards to Pakistan and frankly with India to change that. And so we've got young men and women as well as zillions and zillions of dollars being wasted. And so I think emotion is not a reason to stay there. And this has nothing to do with the COVID-19. The decision to leave there is the right one. We just need to make sure we've done it in complete, total consultation with our allies, and so that nobody is surprised or left hanging, because so many allies have stuck with us, as well as other coalition partners from the very beginning.
Thank you, Ben. Anyone else who wants to add something on this?
Yeah, I could just chime in with a couple of thoughts. I guess, you know, unfortunately, Central Asia will not be high on the list of priorities of a second Trump administration for sure, and perhaps also not a Biden administration. Aside from the Afghanistan issue, that you know, that's not a very big deal, but from the perspective of U.S. global posture, but that both. But either Trump or Biden will have to grapple with, and perhaps just finalize some deal, or just, you know, leave it wheeling as it is now. But otherwise, there are some lobbies at work in Washington from Kazakhstan, and maybe now increasingly from Uzbekistan. But the whole capacity of those markets, I don't think is going to be big enough to attract any significant attention, political attention. Although bureaucracies will always be involved in policy making in all those countries, but it will have a fairly low profile. And finally, with regards to China, I don't think COVID is playing into China's hands in any way. I guess it's just chipping away at China's power, especially if the pandemic is going to be protracted. Quite aside from the pressure that China is experiencing right now, I guess it's going to take its toll on the economic growth and on the ability of the Chinese government to actually become more adventurous in its foreign policy. But having said that, I would say it would be just plain silly for a Russian leader to kind of proclaim that China is a threat to Russia, even if NATO, Estonia or Lithuania are not threats in any way. But saying that China is a threat is very silly, given that, you know, China is a huge neighbor of Russia's, and provoking China is not a wise position and not a wise posture for Russia. So Russia should seek to kind of maintain the stability of that relationship, maybe deter China where necessary, and certainly be friends with China, and not trying to kind of antagonize it in any way, even if NATO at some point will no longer be considered a threat.
We have more questions on China, particularly from Mariusz. But Mariusz, I think we'll leave these questions for the discussion about China, which we'll have in 2 weeks' time, and I'm sure that will be the proper place to address those. Unfortunately, the technical issues we experience have eaten quite some time of ours today. So I guess even though we do have many more questions to address, we need to wrap up with the final question, the one which we're going to ask at every panel in this series. And this is about Eastern Europe, where we in Belarus are located. And because the whole project was sort of driven by this question: what kind of policy implications this growing change of geopolitics is going to have for Eastern Europe, and what recommendations we can have for countries in Eastern Europe to make sure that they not only survive, if you will, but you know, try to use this time which is ahead of us to maximize their economic profits, but also, you know, to minimize security threats. So basically, what I want to do is to ask every one of you to provide some quick recommendations for the countries in Eastern Europe, or maybe to some specific countries like Belarus, for example, in light of the discussion we have had. Anyone willing to start with that?
I can.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Speaking about Eastern Europe, I think that conservative scenario is more likely than any other. I mean that in general, nothing will change dramatically concerning situation in Eastern Europe, because most of countries are mobilized concerning political threats and external threats. And if after 2008 we have some kind of withdrawal of United States region, now I think it's scarcely possible, because of this mobilization and because of this new situation after 2014. But at the same time, I think that the best advice for these countries should be ready to resolve security issues themselves. Of course, United States and cooperation with United States is very important, but I think that it will decrease because of some reasons, maybe not so dramatically as with many other partners of the United States, but it will be. So they should be more resilient, they should be more ready to resolve security issues themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. So anyone else on how East European nations could better navigate these turbulent times? Ben, please.
So first of all, even though the U.S. looks out of sorts right now, don't lose confidence in your American friends. 300, more than 300 million people, so much talent, and you know, we make a mess of things sometimes, but we eventually get it right. And so I have great confidence that we will emerge out of this on the other side of the, regardless of who the president is, who wins the election. On the other side of this, if anything, a free and open society is able to adapt and learn more quickly. That's the point. So even though it's kind of ugly right now, on the other side of it, we'll have adapted and learned more quickly. And then, so that's my point to our friends in Eastern Europe. What are the institutions that make a society resilient, which values young people, which helps unleash the talent of young people? And that's institutions such as a free and open media that allows and provides for this kind of challenge of what's going on, and for discussion and a learning and adaptation. If young people start voting with their feet, then everything is going to be under the control of the old people who want to live in the past. So I would encourage our friends in Eastern Europe to look for ways to unleash the talent of their young people, so the young people want to stay there and work for the future of their own country. None of that, and no economic development is going to happen if you are anchored to the Kremlin like Venezuela.
Yeah, I just say quickly, and to wrap it up, deliver economically. I'm in no position, of course, to give any advice to Eastern Europe from Moscow. But in my personal capacity, I would say just show some clear, economic growth. Post some economic growth. Make sure the citizens support your governments because of of the fact that they deliver economically, and there you go, basically, between East and West, and Russia, and then no one cares about anchoring in any kind of block. That would be my message as an expert.
So it's the economy is stupid, right? That's the message. Okay, Paul, please go on.
Yeah, just final word, because that city has not been mentioned. I totally subscribe to what Ben said about alliances between the US and Germany, France, UK. You mentioned strong alliances. I totally subscribe to that. One issue, getting back to the question of countries in Eastern Europe, please have a look at Brussels. I mean, it's the European Union, and the European Union is, there's a lot to gain from the European Union, and that's an ally, and a very important one.
Okay, thank you so much. And once again, I really apologize for the technical issues which have stolen quite some time. And Jakob is now supporting the argument about the EU with the EU flag. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and all the contribution. And I really hope that we can continue cooperating and discussing all these issues. This project promises to be quite an interesting endeavor, and I'm sure we'll be digging and diving deeper into some interesting issues here and there, and we'll be happy to share it with you. Before we end our discussion, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to announce that the next meeting is going to take place in exactly in a week time and exactly at the same time, and we'll make sure that no technical issues will arise, so please do join us. And the second thing is I want to pass it over to Jakob, who promised to provide us with a few takeaways from this discussion, even though, again, because of the issues we had, we couldn't address all the issues, but all the questions, but I'm sure there are quite interesting things to carry away from this discussion. Jakob, please.
Thank you, Henry. Before we started the session, or just a few days ago when we discussed, we literally flipped a coin. Who will be moderating the actual discussion and who will only be saying the words of welcome and then make the takeaways. So Yohini had the honor of moderating a wonderful panel, so I took some notes. And we will also make sure to have the takeaways presented somewhere online after this discussion. So we had a very intense discussion this afternoon, which started with some turbulences, which I think underscore the necessity for one of the important points that we made, which is enhanced resilience. That was made by Paul in the beginning, but it was supported by many other arguments. There was Mikhail who mentioned that the cost of post-truth is going to be even stronger, since people are literally dying now from misinformation, so lives are at stake. Societies need to be increasingly paying attention to resilience. And Paul said reforms among the awareness is important to raise in order to live up to resilience. A lot focused on economy, Andrei pointed out in his report that the economy is shrinking now in the US. The question is, how does this influence the United States' role in this? Paul made the point that US security policy will be strongly linked to economy, trade, and also energy. So this is important. Where does the economy go? Ben pointed out in this regard that the US and the West as an alliance should be competing more in the economic space to make sure that they preserve their own way of dealing with things, and it's not taken away from them. And this is even more important than the military in some regards. Whereas Mikhail pointed out that the economic development might even play into the hands of the US, since many countries might be turning back towards them. The structural fallout, as he said, will be harder for poor countries than for rich ones, such as the United States. This takes us over to the point alliances, which was also discussed in detail. Paul made the point that independently of the result of the United States presidential elections this year, there will be continued pressure from the US on institutions and alliances to be reformed. There's a big need for reform. Ben pointed out that that a big share of the US population was frustrated or is frustrated with the way the downside of capitalism and globalization, that they were disenfranchised and were left behind. So this has not changed dramatically over the last years. People still want to see changes in this. So the US will not be able to, you said, deter Russia, contain Iran, and be in conflict with China at the same time. So the United States will need strong alliances, especially a strong European pillar in international security, including, you pointed this out a few times, Germany. But it is unfair to only look at the United States. If they leave or alliances or want to exert pressure on them to have reforms, it is important to look at how other countries are behaving, and they need to be held accountable for their actions. There needs to be accountability, and Paul added this level playing fields in the economy, but also in terms of artificial intelligence. So alliances need to be made fairer from a US perspective. The transatlantic partnership will have to be strengthened. There was a point that Andrei added to this, but the question is, how will the world deal with China? Ben predicted that or he hopes to be wrong on this prediction, that in 5 to 10 years there might be a kinetic conflict with China, which will be happening on different fields, including the information space. Andrei pointed out several scenarios, one of them being a cold or even a hot war, but was more positive or more optimistic about this, saying that through strengthening a cooperation and the necessity for both to strike a deal, there might be some hope that the US and China will find a way to get along. Still, Mikhail pointed this out, there is civil activism, which is strengthened through the reaction to COVID, also in China, especially in Hong Kong. That will be a strong factor also in the US-China relations. So the US need also to reach out to those movements in order to make a point in favor of a strong society and in freedom globally. And that will have an effect also on US-China relations and on the role of China, how that will come out of the crisis as a player in world politics. Recommendations towards countries of Eastern Europe include predictions on what to do. Andrei's assessment that not much will change, and this is also true for the broader role of the US. Most of you pointed out that there won't be a complete change of the position and the priorities. Same will be happening in Eastern Europe, will be visible in Eastern Europe, but the countries will have to be more self-reliant and more resilient themselves to solve security issues. I think this is in line with what we've heard about how the US wants Europe to be more responsible. That includes Eastern Europe. Ben said, don't lose confidence in the United States. We will eventually get it right. I think this is a wonderful final remark, but the countries of Eastern Europe should make sure that young people don't go away. Governments should make it more attractive for them to stay. This was supported by Mikhail, who said the countries and governments need to create economic growth to be attractive for the youth. And Paul made this wonderful final statement that we should not forget about Brussels, the European Union, as a key player on the European continent within the sphere of the Eastern Partnership, and beyond this is a power to be reckoned with. And keeps thinking that the US are an important partner, which we have heard from Angela Merkel yesterday, who, by the way, also spoke for and at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung digitally. Thank you from my point to all of you who made this a wonderful, rich discussion, and thank you, Yohini, for your moderation.
Thank you to everyone once again. We really appreciate it, and we'll stay in touch.
You can find the papers from Andre and Paul online on our websites, on Minsk Dialogue website, and also Paul's has been published on United States Office of CAS. So you can continue reading or read it if you haven't read this before. And we will be back with you next time about Russia. This time we hope, we cannot promise, but we hope to have less technical difficulties.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Very good evening to everyone. Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.